Aloha everyone, my name is Luisa Castro. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on challenges and opportunities of implementing food safety programs in commercial aquaponic production of fresh fruits and vegetables. We apologize for needing to reschedule this webinar and any inconvenience this may have caused, but are happy to have so many of you taking time from your busy lives to join us online this evening for what we hope will be a very informative webinar. Okay. Okay, so some online etiquette. We're going to start and end on time. We're hoping that you can please turn off your webcams because that'll make it easier for you, especially if you don't have the best internet. It'll be easier for you to watch the presentation. And except for the speaker, everyone's going to be placed on mute. We're going to address people's questions at the end of the entire presentation to conserve time, but feel free to start posting your questions in the chat box. And of course, be respectful of your presenters and each other, and then of course, provide us with feedback. And we're going to give you all our contact information at the end of this presentation. So I have the honor of presenting with my colleagues that come from so many different backgrounds and organizations. We have Peter Oshiro, who's with the Environmental Health Program Manager. He's in the Sanitation and Food and Drug Branch with the State of Hawaii Department of Health. And we also have Ruth Ellen Klinger-Bowen. She's an aquatic health specialist with the Research Corporation at the University of Hawaii and is an affiliate faculty at UHC grant program. Myself, I'm the Ag Food Safety Program Manager with the Hawaii Department of Agriculture, and we have Lynn Nakamura Tengan. She's a food safety educator at the University of Hawaii College of Tropical Agriculture and Human Resources. And of course, we also have Bradley Kai Fox, and he's the new Sustainable Agriculture instructor at Windward Community College. So as I mentioned, I'm the Ag Food Safety Program Manager, overseeing a newly created Hawaii Produce Safety Program at the Hawaii Department of Agriculture. H2A is now working with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration to provide outreach, education, technical assistance, and in the future, inspection of Hawaii fruit and vegetable farms that will be affected by the FSMA Produce Safety Rule. So I've recently been awarded a cooperative agreement with the FDA to build a program to promote understanding of the produce safety rule. And I'm collaborating with other state agencies, our university cooperative extension, nonprofit organizations throughout the state, hosting Produce Safety Alliance grower trainings, of which there have been 7 in the last 2 years. In the near future, along with our cooperative extension agents, we're going to be conducting on-farm readiness reviews, which are opportunities for farmers to contact us and have us invite us over to their farms. And how, it'll be like a Q&A opportunity for farmers to see where are they in the compliance with the produce safety rule. And we'll be able to provide resources and technical assistance before inspections start. We're also going to be offering food safety certification cost subsidies. It's a grant program, and it's going to be able to subsidize farms for their efforts in coming into compliance with the produce safety rule and with good agricultural practices. So just heard the good news today that we are just waiting for Governor Ige's approval, and that should be rolling out, hopefully, if not by the end of this year, in the beginning of next year. And then in the near future, we're going to be conducting inspections. So a little background on the Food Safety Modernization Act, also known as FSMA, and specifically the Produce Safety Rule when it came into being. So a lot of folks don't realize, but there have been decades and decades of illness outbreaks, import safety issues, market disruptions that really shook consumer confidence. And it did impose a lot of costs to the food system and to the health system. So Congress mandated a shift to prevention, to establishing a modern system of food safety protection based on science and following good agricultural practices and other requirements. So they wanted us to be not reacting to problems, but on preventing them from happening in the first place. So it was a bipartisan act marking a real sweeping change in government regulation of food protection and processing. And it was the first in more than 70 years, not since like a 1930 some Food and Cosmetics Act. So FSMA was signed into law by President Obama back in January 2011. There are actually 7 final FSMA rules. The produce safety rule became effective January 26, 2016. And it actually sets national standards for farms that grow, harvest, pack, and hold produce. It's a tiered compliance date based on annual sales. So farmers are needing to come into compliance based on their annual sales of produce. And there's also several types of exemptions. So we'll be going through this really quickly here. But I want to make sure that you folks understand what is covered and not covered under the FSMA produce safety rule. There is an exhaustive list, meaning these are right now the produce that are exempt from the produce safety rule because they're rarely consumed raw. So from asparagus all the way to water chestnuts and along with grains, these are the foods that if a grower is growing them, they are exempt from the produce safety rule. Now, this is FSMA's non-exhaustive list of covered produce, and it includes everything from almonds all the way to yams. And if it's not on this list, it's still a covered produce. They just couldn't fit it all in one place. So this is called the non-exhaustive list because there could be others that you're not seeing there. And, you know, you're going to see some strange commodities that you might think shouldn't be on the list, like taro. And we're working with the FDA to provide a variance for this, and we can talk about that in another webinar. But if you grow any of these things, you're considered growing a covered produce, covered by the produce safety rule. So there's also compliance dates for covered farms. Now, if you're a large farm making greater than $500,000 in average gross produce annual sales in the preceding 3 years, the compliance date for you was, well, January 26, 2018. You should have started already. Small farms, those are the ones that are considered making greater than $250,000 but less than $500,000 in average gross produce annual sales in the preceding 3 years. Their compliance date is starting pretty soon, a couple of months or several months, January 28, 2019. Then we have the very small farms making greater than $25,000 but less than $250,000 in average gross produce annual sales in the preceding 3 years. Their compliance date is not until January 27, 2020. So now there are some qualified exemptions, farms that are not completely having to do all the requirements of the produce safety rule, but they need to do a few things. So these are the farms where the majority of the average annual monetary value of all their food that they sell are to qualified end users, meaning to retailers, to farmers markets, to restaurants. And so this is during the preceding 3 years, they're making less than $500,000, growing one of those covered produce, but it's ending up at qualified end users. So this doesn't mean, though, if you do cause a foodborne outbreak, your exemption is revoked. You must also be showing records that you fall within this exemption. And the records, the retention of records, you should have already been keeping these records to prove you're a qualified exempt farm as of January 26, 2016. There's also a labeling requirement for these qualified exempt farms that doesn't come into effect until 2020. And basically, you have to show your farm name and complete business address. And it's got to be shown prominently in the package of the produce label or at the point of purchase, on a poster, a sign, or a placard. Okay, so then there are farms making less than $25,000. They're exempt from the produce safety rule. I also have to make a note. There is a water compliance requirement that right now the FDA is taking a look at again, because there was pushback with the water requirement in the produce safety rule. And so the FDA has given extensions for all these farms, the large, small, and very small, giving them 4 more years to come into compliance once they roll out the information about the water requirements. Okay, so in going back to the Federal Register, the actual information that of all the comments and all the bits and pieces of the produce safety rule, I started to look at where aquaponics came up. And I found out aquaponic farms are not excluded from the produce safety rule. In fact, FDA said, quote, "We do not intend to prohibit using aquaponic farming systems to grow covered produce." And there was a lot of information back and forth between people providing comments to the FDA and their providing feedback. So one comment was, some comments asked FDA to consider establishing additional regulations specifically applicable to aquaponic operations as well as hydroponic production. So the FDA comes back and says, at this time, we are not establishing additional standards specifically applicable to aquaponic or hydroponic production. Basically, what they want to do is they believe the production methods and safety considerations associated with aquaponics is the same as like growing in a soil environment. If you're sufficiently addressing through the provisions of the rule, the sections about soil amendments of animal origin, about water, about harvesting, you're covered by the produce safety rule. We're not going to make any other kind of exemptions or other new regulations for aquaponics. So that was good to hear. So what do aquaponic growers have to consider with the produce safety rule? So if they are covered, there's going to be conditions and practices that contribute to microbial contamination, just like soil-based farms. And that's going to include worker health hygiene training, equipment, tools, buildings, sanitation, dealing with domesticated and wild animals, ag water. This is pre-harvest water, irrigation water, and hand washing, and things that come into contact with the food. There's also the biological soil amendments, using raw manure, stabilized compost. So I'm going to go through just some real specific ones that have been of great concern to aquaponic growers. Subpart E of the produce safety rule. It talks about ag water. So when covered produce is grown in an aquaponic system in which the water is not intended or likely to contact the harvestable portion of the produce, the part of the produce you're going to harvest and that's going to be eaten, that water is not considered ag water for the purposes of this rule. On the other hand, when covered produce is grown in an aquaponic system in which water is intended or likely to contact the harvestable portion of the produce, that water is ag water for the purposes of this rule and must meet the requirements that are going to come out in several years with the produce safety rule. And it's going to be microbial quality requirements and water testing requirements. So again, if the water doesn't touch the edible portion of the crop, this water would not be considered agriculture water and would not need to meet the ag water requirements. So as an aquaponic grower, you would have to make 100% sure that the water that you are growing your produces would never come into contact with that harvestable portion of the crop. So now let's take a look at subpart F, which deals with the biological soil amendments of animal origin and human waste. So an example is like the raw manure. So FDA does not consider the liquid-only matrix to be growth media. So basically, the water effluent, the fish effluent, is not considered a biological soil amendment. So if fish effluent water never comes into direct contact with the edible portion of the plant, and we're seeing that ag water standards of the produce safety rule don't apply, then aquaponic growers are not needing to really worry about this situation, right? But if the aquaponic grower keeps the water to only contacting the plant roots, then that fish effluent water is not ag water. But if someone, say, is concentrating the fish poop, like in a filter, and then scraping it off into a collection bin, and then using this to amend their soils for covered produce, then yeah, that's going to be considered raw manure. However, fish poop just floating around in the water, in their tanks, in an aquaponic system is not considered raw manure, according to subpart F of the produce safety rule. Okay, now let's look at subpart I, which deals with domestic and wild animals. Basically, it's only applied to other animals. It doesn't apply to fish. So when we're talking about domestic animals, fish enclosed in a system that has to do with aquaponics is not considered domestic and wild animals that you have to now try to get out of the system. So subpart I is not intended to address the potential contamination from the fish used as part of an aquaculture system. It's part of the system, so it's not separate from it. So they're not considering it as something that has to be kept away from the growing of the produce. So like, chickens running around in your, operation, or your domestic, cat inside your enclosed aquaponic system. If you have those things happening, then you have to take that subpart I into consideration as potential sources of contamination. There's also produce safety rule as it pertains to subpart K, the harvesting section. So this requires immediately prior to and during harvest activities for the growers to take all measures necessary to identify and not harvest produce that is likely to be contaminated with a known or foreseeable hazard. So this is where water tests are going to be really important in the future for growers needing to comply with the produce safety rule. Because if the water tests are showing any evidence of E. coli, and there might be a situation where workers are harvesting the covered produce and for some reason water gets onto the edible portion when that's being harvested, then the workers are going to have to take measures necessary to identify what is this hazard and then not harvest anything that's been contaminated by water that does have levels of E. coli that are not allowed within the water requirement of the produce safety rule. So moving along, my last slide that I want to cover is a confusion that people have with gap audits and produce safety rule inspections, two separate things. So gap audits are market access audits. They are ways to demonstrate to buyers that you have met the requirements of a third-party audit. It also does show you have implemented requirements that appear in the produce safety rule. Now, if you do just a produce safety inspection, that is a way to demonstrate to the federal government or to state regulators that you are complying with the requirements of the produce safety rule. That's it. It doesn't help you pass a third-party audit. Okay, so gap audits also, it confirms your compliance with the gap standards, and it does align with the produce safety rule technical requirements. Now, if you're a farmer following the produce safety rule, basically doing an inspection confirms compliance with the produce safety rule. It does not make you compliant with a gap audit. If you do a gap audit, it's voluntary. Produce safety rule inspection, it's mandatory. A gap audit will happen annually upon request. The produce safety rule inspection, there's no predetermined frequency. We're going to figure that out in the future when it starts to happen. There is a fee for service for a gap audit. There's no cost to the producer for an inspection. A gap audit can be done on any crop as long as the grower requests it. Produce safety rule, the inspection is only going to cover covered crops, those that are considered a raw agricultural commodity. For a gap audit, if a grower currently sells to different buyers, then they might be doing several different audits with different companies. So the produce safety rule inspection, it's one inspection. Most likely going to be with the Department of Agriculture, and the frequency of inspections is not yet outlined in the rule, so we're going to be working on that. And lastly, a gap audit, a farmer is going to receive a certificate that they have met the audit standards and the acceptance criteria. And for the produce safety rule inspection, it's the farmer will receive some sort of inspection document. So that is the end of my section.